Hey everyone, if you're just signing in, make sure you introduce yourself into the chat. And we're going to get started here in about 3 minutes. So we got 3 minutes to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from and some of the big wins that you had from last week, some of the things that kind of stood out for you. The reason I'm asking that is that when you recall what those big wins are, it'll help you to get caught back up with the content and get you ready for learning, get that prefrontal cortex turned on. Hey, Mark, how's it going? If Jen's there, say thanks for her really kind note. That was really nice. Hey, Seek to Find from Lloydminster. How you guys doing? We're going to start in 3 minutes, guys. It's session 5 of the Introduction to Permaculture. And I've got a little surprise for you guys tonight. Hey, Gabby, nice to see you. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail into some of our design process and hopefully clarify a few questions that I've been asked over the last week. So if you're just signing in, just introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from. Hey, Genevieve. Hey, Frankie. Nice to see you guys. So just a reminder, just let us know what your wins were for last week. What were the things that stood out for you? Things that made you think twice. Sounds like Genevieve was thinking about swales. Evelyn, nice to have you on board. Hi from Edmonton. Made myself a terracotta pot heater for my greenhouse this week. Awesome, great. Jordan, oh man, wish I could tune in. It's 10 a.m. in Japan, but I work, but we'll see you on YouTube. Yeah, it'll be on later, so don't worry about it, Jordan. Field Bee, greetings to all. I'm wearing a bee hat. Kona, hey Rob, Lee here in Jordan, or Lee here in Calgary, sorry. Dell, thank you so much for your kind email. It really touched me. Same with you, Frankie. Thank you for your email. I'm gonna make a little special place for you guys in the show today. Hello from Deborah in Eastern Capel Valley, Saskatchewan. I love Capel Valley. Holly, hello from Rich and Holly in El Paso, Texas. Hey guys, nice to have you on board. We're going to start in 1 minute, guys. Session 5 of Introduction to Permaculture. And if you're just signing in, let us know what stood out for you last week. What was the aha moment that you had, or multiple aha moments, just to get your brain into learning mode. I find it's really helpful. What were the things that you took home that really stood out for you? Hi from Iowa. Hi, Philip. Thanks, Frankie. All right, guys, we're going to get started here right away. Let's get into session 5. I've got a special surprise for you guys tonight. I think it'll help to clarify a few questions. The front of the presentation might be a little bit chunky just as I get started here, because I've got a couple different screen shares to show you guys. All right, so if this is your first time signing in to the Introduction to Permaculture, welcome. The other 4 sessions are available on YouTube, and I'd love for you to go and watch them. I've also started breaking up the content into smaller bite-sized chunks, so if you can't afford the full hour, you'll find that there's also smaller little segments that will help to kind of get you up to speed. Or if there are specific things that stood out for you, I might have captured that in some of those small sections. So feel free to check that and look at those segments and try and keep your learning up. Permaculture is a really big subject, and so it takes a lot of contemplation and thinking to really capture the essence of permaculture. So I'm really working hard to build our channel out to try and make that content accessible to you in a way that you can understand. So I'm just going to adjust my camera here just a little bit. So I'm noticing that you can see the background there. My background's not quite large enough there to block out the whole office. Anyhow, here we go. So most people that attend our programs are depressed at the state of the world, hate their job, and feel hopeless. Our education process and supportive community help permaculture grads to start their own businesses so that they can live out their dreams while making the world a better place. And we have this incredible database of students on our website that I encourage you guys to check out at vergepermaculture.ca because it showcases different ways that you can use permaculture to make a living for yourself. It's amazing how many of our grads have gone on to make permaculture businesses. So I encourage you guys to check out our grads and alumni page on our website, and I can leave a link to that if you guys are interested a little bit later. As you guys know, for the people that have been signing into all the sessions, we're following the Introduction to Permaculture book. So every once in a while, you'll see a page number on the bottom left or bottom right-hand side. And if you have that book, by all means, open it up and check it out. I highly recommend reading it if you haven't read it, or reading it again if you have read it. If you don't have it, I highly recommend this book. It's a little bit hard to get a hold of, so and sometimes quite expensive, but it's worth the money in my opinion. So we wanted to go live on YouTube, as I said just earlier, to create a ton more content. My goal this year is to produce a video a day for the entire year, and sometimes 2 videos a day. I really feel like there's an awful lot of room to create more content around permaculture on YouTube and to raise the awareness. And I think everybody will benefit from it. Everybody within the permaculture space will benefit from this. There's a lot of videos on site, which is great because it shows you how to do things on site. And we're going to make some more of those too. But there's just not a lot of lessons that you can get on YouTube for free. And so I wanted to create that space for people to ask questions of somebody who's been in the space for a little bit of time, so that you can get your questions answered. I know that when I was first getting into it, I didn't have a place to ask questions, regarding permaculture. So that's really why I decided to go live on YouTube and do this for free. Typically, this course is something we do live in a community hall or something like that, and it costs $100 or $150 to take the course. But I wanted to reach a larger audience, and hopefully you guys are benefiting from all of this knowledge and you're sharing it with people around you to help explain what this crazy big thing of that permaculture actually is. And based on a couple of the emails I got this week, I can tell that it's starting to resonate with some people. So that's really great. So last week we talked about rain tanks. We talked about the anatomy of a rainwater harvesting system. We talked about forests as actively managed lakes. We talked a little bit about swales, and we talked about urban/zone 1 and 2 swales. So these are the small swales that you'll find in small little gardens. This week, we're going to talk about 3 new water harvesting features, but I have a little surprise for you guys. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on something that I feel gets missed in a lot of permaculture programs. And obviously, we're limited to an hour tonight, so I can't go into the entire amount of depth, but I think this will get you a sense of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about water access structures. So in the last section, we were talking about water harvesting and how important it is. We were talking about how water is central to life, and we can think about water as the gas and sun as the gas pedal. So if you live in a climate with lots of water and lots of sun, you're driving an alcohol dragster. If you're living in a climate like I am with not too much rain but lots of sun, then you're still driving an alcohol dragster, except that the engine keeps stalling. And so you have to find ways to get more fuel into the system. And then if you're driving a car where there's lots of water but not much sun, then you're flooding your engine. And so sometimes in those scenarios, sometimes you're trying to sort out how to manage the water. And in fact, there's a couple of people on the call tonight from Quadra, and they've got a really interesting situation because they're in a climate where it gets lots of rain through the winter time with no sun, and then they get tons and tons of sun with no rain. And so the question that I got asked from Jen this week from Quadra was, how do we manage this massive inequity between winter and summer? And the question is always in nature. How does nature do it? How does nature move from one season into another and yet seem to manage without going into drought and also potentially going into flood? And so the answer is actually sitting right in your backyard. And your ecosystem is designed for perennial systems, and perennial systems that cast shade, or at least combinations of, I know specifically Mark and Jen are looking at silver pasture systems. So it's all about managing the water cycle in the winter and managing it in the summer. And so in the summertime, it's about reducing the amount of evaporation through the use of dappled shade. That's where the silviculture comes in. And in the wintertime, it's about having enough of those trees there to actually soak up that water and put it to productive use. And it's about finding that middle balance and not trying to force function the ecosystem in one way or the other. And you guys are going to do just fine, I know it. So let's get into this stuff. But before we do, I did talk about this book last week, and I wanted to go into a little bit more depth about this because I'm going to give you one of my secrets, and it's not really a secret, except that I know that this really helped me when I was first getting started. I remember taking my permaculture design course and coming out of it, and I just got blasted with all the water harvesting ideas and different methods and techniques. And I think one of the biggest risks that you can have coming out of a permaculture design course, or even this intro course, is to come at this from a technique perspective. Okay, what do I mean by that? There are literally thousands upon thousands of techniques that you can go and capture from this course and from other courses. And you can go and blindly apply these techniques to your landscape. And you're probably going to make big mistakes. The whole goal behind permaculture is to teach you how to think, to teach you how to think critically, so that when you are in that situation where you need to figure out how to harvest water or whatever your limiting resource constraint is for the property that you're trying to sort out, and usually water is one of the first ones that we think about, which is why we have that water access to structures, you need to not go straight to swales. You need to go straight to, okay, what's the diagnosis? What's the problem? What's the limiting factor? What's the resource constraint that I'm trying to solve? And then what are the tools in my toolbox that I have to address that resource constraint? And sometimes it's going to be water. Sometimes it's going to be nutrients. Sometimes it's going to be soil carbon. Sometimes it's going to be human labor. It's amazing how often the farms that we visit, human labor is the primary resource constraint, not swales, not tractors, not cows. It's labor. It's time and it's labor. And so we have to be in a position where we're critically thinking enough so that we are able to properly diagnose the system. So assuming that you've diagnosed the system, and because we're talking about water tonight, again, from a continuation from last time, I wanted to give you guys a bit of a step-by-step process that I use whenever I get involved in any project. Okay, so this is part of my front-end diagnosis that I do on every project. And there's no reason for you guys to not do this on your own project now as well. So step number one, and I'm going to come back to this book here in 2 seconds. I just want to show you guys something here. Let me just change my screen share. All right, so you should be seeing my desktop now. I want to just point out this map that I've got here, and I'm going to show you a couple of different maps. We'll start with this one here. So this is a map from a client of mine, and this map is a contour map. And so the image in the back is not super high res. So usually I try and get a higher res photo. If I can, I'll use a drone shot or a series of drone shots that I stitch together. Or in Alberta, we have a lot of high resolution photography that you can get for a fairly good price. So I'll get a high resolution photograph. Then if I'm in Alberta, I'll buy some data, which is essentially LiDAR or points that I can get from space. And then from there, I can produce this contour map. Now, the reason I want this contour map, remember we were talking about water access and structures. And so one of the first things that I want to do is I want to figure out where the high spots and the low spots are. Remember how I talked about mapping out where the water is coming from and where it's going to? And some of you guys did that. Some of you guys provided me with images with houses and water flow. Well, when we're looking at larger properties or smaller properties, the process is still the same. When we get into these larger properties, what happens is the roof just gets bigger. Okay, and so now we've got 5, 10, 20 acres, 160 acres, and that's the size of our roof. And then the way that that roof interacts with the rain is a little bit different as well. So on ground that has grass and soil and things like that, a lot of it gets absorbed. Usually up to 97% of the water that hits the ground is going to go into the ground, which is what we want. And so these yellow lines, they look pretty pixelated, but these are water flows. Okay, so this is where the water is coming from and where it's going to. Okay, so this gives me a lot of insight. And in fact, the GPS didn't quite pick it up, but there's actually water flowing right through this central valley here. You can see that this is a valley. Okay, this is the same thing that we were talking about last time when I showed you how to map using your hand and using a contour map. So we know where the water is going to. We know that it's crossing this road here. We know that there's going to be another water issue down here. And then you'll notice in this side right here, we've got all the different catchments. So I can actually see how big the roof is. And then I can make some assessments with regards to how much water is actually going to flow through those areas. And then from there, I can size things. So that's how we assess the roof on a property. And on a house or on an urban property, we do the same thing, except that it's just a little bit more compact. Okay. Here's another image. This is an image that I took with my drone, and we've got all the contour lines here again. So if we want to do a water assessment, this one was not a very interesting water assessment because the water really wasn't too problematic here. There were other issues in our diagnosis that we came up with. There was a high pressure gas line. It was a sour gas line, and a lot of low points right here, which is really wet, so it's tough to build. So there are other issues associated with this, but this is a contour map that we use to give us information about what's going on the property. This one's another interesting one. And so again, we can see these catchments right here, and they represent different amounts of area in square meters. Okay, and so the darker the color, the deeper or the more catchment that this little rill has access to. And so this gives us clues as to where to put ponds, where to put swales if they're appropriate, and how to infiltrate water appropriately. And all of this information is directly captured through the use of contour mapping, which is what we were talking about last time. Now, why is this important? Why is this contour mapping important? Why is it important to understand how water is moving through the landscape? Why is it important to understand slope? Why is it important to understand soil and conditions and things like that? And that's where I want to bring up. This is my little cheat that I think you guys will benefit from immensely. And it's also a little bit of a plug for Brad Lancaster, but he's a great guy, and I really like the work that he does, and his work has really benefited my work. So, and I know that his work will also benefit you as well. So I'm going to change my share here again one more time. So once you understand the characteristics of the water moving through the landscape, how much there is, how deep it is, what the runoff events might look like, which again, the drone will help you to sort out. And it doesn't have to be a drone. Usually there's data available that you can actually go and get for inexpensive or sometimes even for free. It depends on where you live. So this is volume 2 of Brad Lancaster's book. And I'm just gonna see if I can get this sorted out. So there we go. And I want to just back to this might be, is that better? No. Sorry, guys. Okay, so when I left my PDC and I had all these water harvesting ideas in my head and I didn't know how to apply any of them, this is the book that saved me. This is the book that when I opened it up and I actually started reading it, gave me all sorts of insights. So I highly recommend you get this. And I know Brad is, I'm not sure how many more copies are left of this book, because I think there's another edition coming out. And I wouldn't bother waiting for the other edition if there's still ones available, because this one is just so great. I mean, I'm sure I would recommend owning both of them, to be honest with you. But inside of the book, and I've got it marked, he's got a great section in here on how to think about water harvesting. And this is volume 2, by the way. I also recommend, he just rewrote volume 1. Very, very good book. Highly recommend it. This is the piece de résistance, or the thing that will make all the difference when you're trying to sort out water harvesting. Now, if you've taken my permaculture design course, like Mark has, and a few other people I think on the call have, I have another version of this that we talk about in the class. But this is a really great resource that you can get your hands on right now. So I'm just going to zoom this in just a little bit so you guys can see what I can see here. Hopefully you get a sense of this. And so this is the best part of the book. Well, the best part of the book is the whole book, but I really like how Brad laid this out, because what he's got here is he's got this top section on the top here. For example, he lays out chapter 2 is about berm and basin. So that's what he calls a swale. And then he describes what it is. So there's a really short description of what it is. There's goals, where to use it, cautions specific to strategy, and variations. Okay. And Then he's got terraces, French drain, infiltration basin, imprinting, mulch. On the other side, hardscape reduction, diversion swale, check dam, vegetation. And so each one of these little categories represents a chapter. So if you want more information on berm and basin, you go to chapter 2. And he's got an entire chapter written on berm and basin. That's the one I just opened up to is the terrace one. He's got calculations, construction details. This is honestly one of the best water harvesting books out there, so I highly recommend it. And if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to answer towards the end of the call today. And so when I do a water harvesting project, which is pretty much every project that I do, I have to consider water harvesting. I have most of this memorized now because I've been at it for 10 years. But when I was first starting out, this was a really great reference for me to remember all the different types of water harvesting techniques and where they were appropriate and where they weren't appropriate. And that's almost as important as where they are appropriate. So I highly recommend checking that out. And again, if you have any questions about it, let me know. So we start with the map. We understand where the water is coming from, where it's going to, what the scale of water actually is. And then from there, we look at what the appropriate water harvesting features actually are, if we actually even need water harvesting features, because sometimes we don't. Yeah, and just before we go on here, guys, I wanted to just reach out and say thanks to a few people. I asked you guys last week to tell me what you were getting out of the class, and I received some really incredible, heartfelt emails. It totally made my week. And so I really wanted to thank you guys. There's a bunch of you guys who have been sending me donations. Totally not what I expected. I didn't expect to get any donations, but I really appreciate it. Every little bit helps. And so I just wanted to acknowledge you guys for doing that, and definitely gets noticed. And so thank you very much for the donations and for the emails. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I also wanted to just make a couple other quick announcements, and then we're going to get into the content here again. Yeah, so I have two more things to say, and then we'll get straight into this, and then we'll go to questions afterwards. So first of all, I wanted to show you guys the new Verge t-shirts that we have. They're not available online, but I thought you guys would get find it quite. Let me get a bigger image here. I think you'll find it quite funny. I think that the sustainability stuff has to be fun, has to attract more people. So keep calm and grow a pair. If you're in Calgary and you want one of these, come on by the office and we can hook you up. And then there's one other. I know you're going to get a kick out of this Mark Dahl. Manitoba Maple, it says Manitoba Maple, I'd tap that. So anyways, if you're in the Calgary area and you want one of those t-shirts, by all means, come and pick one up. And then I have a question for this week. So if you guys are so inclined to email me, again, I'd really appreciate it. What questions about permaculture are you dying to ask that I can produce a video about? I'd love to answer them. So get in touch with me, send me an email, and let me know what it is that you'd love to hear about. And I would love to produce a video on that. All right, let's get into the content here, guys. So curb cuts are honestly one of my favorite water harvesting features. They are passive. So once they're set up, they just continue to work. And they are incredible opportunities for cities to retrofit themselves. And so the way that a curb cut is set up is essentially we look for boulevards along the side of roads, and we look for opportunities to infiltrate water in those boulevards. And typically these boulevards are exactly how these ones look, minus the mulch basins, where they're just kind of desertified, because what we do is we elevate the soil above the road surface, and then none of the water on the road can actually get access to it. And then we've got this massive stormwater liability that we have to deal with. And so Calgary is actually starting to implement these in a really big way. And a lot of cities are recognizing that they can dramatically reduce their stormwater costs by just putting some basins alongside the roads and cutting some curbs. Now, you can, I don't recommend going and doing this and breaking the law without permission from the city, but that's exactly how Brad Lancaster got started. He started cutting curbs around his neighborhood and started proving that they worked so well that finally the city couldn't ignore them anymore. And now Tucson, Arizona encourages them all over the city because they recognized that it was a multi-million, probably even $1 billion liability that was being solved by these inexpensive community activated earthworks. And so literally what happens is that the water flows along the street, takes a left-hand turn into this basin. As soon as the basin's filled, it back floods to the next one, and then to the next one, and then to the next one. And then what you do is you plant water-loving trees kind of in the bottom, and trees that like less water a little bit higher up. And these trees basically clean the urban drool that's washing down these streets. And so this is what I mean. When you get sustainability set up right, it's effortless. You just have to get the design right. So a lot of times we've just gotten the design wrong, and there's opportunities to create right designs that just create greenery. Now, once these systems get established, urban heat island effect goes down, our rivers and streams clean up because now they're not getting all the crap coming off of the cars. Brad even went to the length of testing the wood and the leaves and the fruit, because they planted edible species into these things to see if the heavy metals and the toxins were actually being pulled up into the trees. And it turns out that the trees were accumulating the heavy metals and the toxins, but not the fruiting bodies of the trees, of the plants, which is really neat because that means we can eat the food that comes off of this urban drool. And then we know that the plants are accumulating the stuff, which means it's not going into our rivers and creeks. And at the end of life, we can take those plants and we can compost them and put them back into the soil. And when you get more into studying soil, what you realize is that soil is actually an incredible bioremediation device, and it will just naturally bioremediate things just through its own biology. Wicking beds. This is one of the most popular blogs on our website. This is not a picture from our website, but there's a blog all about wicking beds with these photos. I use these photos because I think they're really clear. However, if you want to see exactly how to build a wicking bed, regardless of the type of container that you use, I now have a 5-part series on YouTube that you can watch for free of me putting that wicking bed together using international bulk shipping containers. So you can go check that out. If somebody can pull that up and stick that into the comments section, the specific playlist, the wicking bed playlist on my YouTube channel, that'd be great. And so the wicking bed is essentially just a raised bed. It's got a liner in it. We typically put a weeping tile into the bottom of ours as well. We fill that up with gravel about 12 inches high. And then the gravel acts as a reservoir. And so what happens is that as the wicking bed fills in this bottom section, the gravel has a natural capillary action that pushes the water up into the soil. And this will make more sense when you see the next image. And so the gravel creates pore space, which allows you to store water, but it also creates capillary action, which pushes the water up into the soil. And so these wicking beds are great for a lot of reasons, but I also don't like them for a lot of reasons as well. And so I'll give it to you win, lose, or draw here. Basically, now the soil's going onto that wicking bed there. You can see there's a fill pipe, and that's the completed system. So I don't like them because they're disconnected from the subsoils. So your plant roots can't go below the landscape fabric in between the gravel and the soil in there, which means that you're constantly having to remineralize these things. I do like them for places where we've got soils that are toxic that you can't grow on because they disconnect you from that soil layer. I like them next to foundations because you don't have to worry about infiltrating too much water next to your foundation and causing a foundation issue. I like them in zone 1 gardens, basically. Now, we installed what I think are the longest wicking beds in the world just down the street from me. They're 50 feet long. We installed 5 of them. And I thought it was a great idea. It was part of the community garden. Because I'm lazy, I hate work, I convinced the community garden committee to let me put in these massive wicking beds. And they're like, yeah, this is great. We're so on board. We don't, we're going to be the smart community garden that doesn't fill ourselves up with labor because we've got these low input self-watering beds and we only have to fill them once a week. And there's all these great things about it. We had to put a liner down anyways, I should just mention, because back in the 1980s, a giant petroleum plant in Calgary exploded and put toxic stuff all over the air and all over the city of Calgary. And so to this day, the city of Calgary still will not allow, in most parts of the city, a community garden to grow right in the soil. which is kind of ironic because my house is like 3 blocks away and I'm growing in the soil. But anyways, that's another conversation. So anyhow, I convinced them to put these wicking beds in, and they worked really well. They still worked. They're still working today. I should probably go make a video about them this spring. The only problem, there's 2 main problems with this, and this was a really important lesson for me and something to think about as well. Work is a failure in design, but sometimes work is a way of creating community, as weird as that sounds. And so I basically designed the action of watering out of these gardens. And in doing so, I actually eliminated cross-pollination and connection among community members that happened to bump into each other when they were watering their beds. Now, before you criticize me for it, what I was thinking was, why would anybody want to go to a community garden in a neighborhood like mine where there's all this lawn everywhere? And the reason being is that, you know, I was thinking, well, I have a kitchen garden right in my backyard. I'm not going to grow my kitchen garden crops 3 or 4 blocks away so that I can keep a lawn going. Like, I'm going to get rid of the lawn, put in a food forest, put in a garden, and then I'm going to use the community garden space to grow my main crop plants, which are basically things like potatoes and parsnips and carrots, Jerusalem artichokes, things that I can plant once, walk away from it, except for my watering duty, and then come back. However, the whole premise behind a community garden, food is just an ancillary benefit to community gardening. The main benefit about community gardening is community. It's building that connection. And so what I did was I designed out the watering function, but I also designed out part of the community function as well. And it's been an interesting type 1 error that I don't know if I would repeat again. The design is great. The technical component of the design is great, but we have to think about the social components of water and the social components of permaculture design as well when we're designing in the technical components as well. So these lessons kind of come from all over the place, and you think you've thought it all through, and then you get slapped in the face with something like this. And it's amazing. If hopefully you're humble and open to receiving that feedback when it comes to you, even if somebody doesn't directly say it to you, you have to always have that observational skill going, you know, always looking for feedback from the system. So here's another wicking bed that a community garden in Canmore put in, same typical design. You'll notice that the plastic doesn't go all the way up to the top, and that's part of the design. It's really important that when you get to the top surface of gravel, that you've got a drainage port. Otherwise, you'll just end up turning this into a giant bathtub. Now, another thing to be cautious of with wicking beds is that because they're self-watering, if you're just constantly applying water into these things, you're never going to allow the soil to dry out, which means that the soils can go anaerobic. It's really important for soils to get hydrated, and then all the pores kind of close together, and then dehydrate as they open back up again and allow a gas exchange. It's really important. That's how soils breathe. And so if you're not careful with wicking beds, you can actually end up making them go anaerobic, or you can end up making them go too dry because you don't have the buffering effect of the subsoils beneath them. So you really are replacing the function of nature by trying to put that reservoir below, and that is on you. Now, I've seen a bunch of designs of wicking beds where they have these automatic watering systems, which is great in theory, except that it suffers from the problem that I just mentioned, which is that you end up making these beds go anaerobic. So something to keep in mind. I think that there's a limited use of wicking beds. Think very carefully before you just go out and build a whole bunch. The other thing is I've had a lot of angry husbands contact me because their wives begged them to build these. And in the building process, they realize how expensive they are. And so they try and cheap out and use poly like this. And it ends up getting punctured in the construction process. And so then they have to dig the entire bed out and keep the gravel and the soil separate. So if you're going to do it, use a proper EPDM liner, which is a rubber liner, like a pond liner. Make sure you're using lots of landscape fabric to prevent the rocks from puncturing things, and get your levels really nice and correct. And if you're interested in more information on these wicking beds, you can go to the Verge Permaculture website and search for our wicking bed blog, or into the YouTube channel and watch our videos on wicking beds. So another interesting design criteria, this is the fill port that you get when you use a weeping tile to fill the water. In a community garden scenario, you need to think about how to prevent this from becoming a cigarette repository. So we actually had to put caps on here and then put a flagstone on top of it to take that temptation of putting cigarette butts into the water hole, because apparently plant roots don't like cigarette butts. I don't know why, and you know, they seem pretty appealing to me, but apparently they don't like it very much. So if you're doing this in a community garden setting, don't forget to design that into the system. Constructed wetlands and ponds. So this is a constructed wetland we built in Invermere. This is where we teach one of our permaculture design courses. There's a big community classroom right here now where this little makeshift roof is. That's the 3,000 square foot passive solar greenhouse in the background, solar thermal to heat the floors, solar photovoltaic for all the power. Bill Swan and Ali's not in this picture, is one of the, probably one of the guys I respect most in my life, actually. If I could aspire to be like anybody, you know, he'd be in the top 5 people that I would put in that list. The guy is incredible in terms of building community, and the amount of life energy that he pumped into this space is absolutely unbelievable. So if you ever meet Bill Swan, give him a hug for me and tell him that he's an amazing dude, because he absolutely is. And I probably don't tell him that enough. The idea with this wetland, this is in Invermere, which is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in Canada. And so the idea was to create a mimic of this wetland right in the community garden itself. And so this wetland fills up from the community kitchen roof. It gets overflow from the greenhouse roof. And then you can't see it here, but if you go onto my YouTube channel, there's a bunch of videos on rainwater harvesting on this site. We actually collect all the rainwater off of the would that be southwest portion of a school roof, which is, you can't see in this photo, that collects in a 20,000 gallon underground cistern, overflows, and then moves through this wetland. And then the wetland itself has 2 spillways right here, which then overflow into rain gardens on either side. And so completely passive, everything gravity flow. This wetland is kind of the Grand Central Station for water on the site, as it delineates which water goes into which garden beds, all passively without any pump energy whatsoever. It was the piece de resistance for this site. And now the wetland is full of fish. It's got tons of wetland plants in there. It's got a pump that pumps water and keeps it circulating. That's the only electricity that it uses, but you can see where it gets its electricity from these photovoltaics up here. And then it feeds a giant food forest right behind it, which is, I think, year 5 or 6. It's really starting to come together now. It's a beautiful, beautiful space. So that's the, there you go. That's the picture from space. So that's the community kitchen that Lush Cosmetics Canada donated. That was a very wonderful donation by them. It collects all this rainwater, and then you can see the downspout, which flows into this pond right here. Now I'll just go through the site quickly while I've got you guys here. So this whole roof right here collects and goes into a downspout, which then comes underground into this tank, which is actually sitting right underneath this white lid right here. This white lid overflows into a swale, which runs the length of this fence. The swale is almost on contour. I had to force function it just a little bit, and we call this Apple Alley. So there's multiple apple trees all the way along here, and growing between it, we've got Jerusalem artichokes and other cover crops. When the swale overflows, it goes into this teardrop shaped constructed wetland, which cleans the water up. And then half the water flows into this mulch basin right here, and half of the water flows into these mulch basins over here. And we're going to make a couple of modifications this year when we're out there, just to improve the flow of water once again. Again, we're always making fine-tuning, we're always fine-tuning little details on the site to make it grow. So all of these little green spots right here are basically mulched basins, and each one has an overstory fruit tree, and it's got shrubs underneath it and herbs. And then you'll notice the other thing, remember, water, access, and structures. So all of the access here, which also, again, it mimics the groundswell logo. That was totally by accident. This access is all angled so that the water that hits it, the limited water that we get in Invermere, actually ends up in the mulch basins themselves. So this path here flows into this mulch basin right here, which is a plum guild. And these paths flow into these mulch basins right here. Again, all to passively irrigate the system. So it just goes. And so just a couple more water features. So this roof right here, this half of the roof feeds into a downspout right there, which flows into this tank. This half of this roof feeds into another downspout, which then feeds directly into the swale right here. So this site is just exploding, and it will continue to explode. Brad Lancaster has this saying where he says, you know, our designs should be beneficial ruins, so that if we disappear from the earth, these systems will just continue to improve year after year. So when we walk away from them, they don't constantly need our attention, which kind of builds into this idea of work as a failure in design. And so we can apply these concepts in all of the projects that we operate. So if you want more images or video of this particular site, check out my YouTube channel. There's lots of videos on rainwater harvesting on this particular property. Here's a constructed wetland that we put at my mother-in-law's property. She has this sump pump that goes off every 5 minutes. We call it Birch Bay Springs. It's a wonderful cabin. It's a wonderful property. However, it's a lesson in not putting basements into places with high groundwater table. Now, that's not really her fault. It was very dry for a few years when they were building this cabin, and over time the groundwater level has increased, and there's lots of different reasons that could have happened. One, it's former lake bottom, but number two, there's plenty of examples of where septic fields and even large buildings have changed the hydrology around the house. And so there's a really good chance that because this house is there now, that it's actually creating its own problem, because and the area that used to infiltrate water is now building up water around the foundation, and that's what we're evacuating with a sump pump. So again, we wanted to try and turn a problem into a solution. So this stays hydrated all summer long, and we decided to plant it out with local wetland plants because we're right beside a lake. And so the water that comes out of the ground is getting cleaned, and we always end up having endangered reptiles living in here, basically mostly frogs and toads. So they've actually taken up home in here, and we've got all this amazing wetland forest that just kind of grows. There's a forest garden behind it. It's doing okay. One of the things that really kind of hit me hard was the amount of deer pressure that we have out there. And so the problem is always a solution, right? And so through putting all of this, I think I put probably $2,000 of fruit trees in here, and there's only a handful of them that have survived. But now I know exactly which fruit trees the deer like and which ones they don't. And so when I'm dealing with a deer landscape, instead of trying to force the landscape to accept certain plants, I now have a repository of plants that I know will survive, where there's lots of deer, rabbit, porcupine, skunk, and I can plant those and be pretty confident that those animals are not going to decimate them. So one of them is Saskatoon, which makes sense. It's totally native to that area, and it thrives. Another one is honeyberry. Romeo cherry is another one. So these are plants that I've, in my own personal experience, have found do not get hit by deer. Apple, on the other hand, not a great choice. Plum, not a great choice. Some of the taller cherries, not a great choice. So always turning that problem into a solution. So in summary, we talked tonight about curb cuts. We talked about wicking beds. We talked about constructed wetlands and ponds. And we also talked about my water harvesting process that I go through on large or small properties, which I can take more questions about if you guys are interested. And in all of this, I mean, this is just a small fraction of the water harvesting features that you can use in your landscapes. I would say if there's one thing to take away from tonight, it is don't get too caught up in the specific water harvesting feature. Okay, it's really, those are the things that are the most sexy, that people get most excited about, that, you know, you take a course like this and you instantly just want to go out and dig a mulch basin or a swale or something like that. Spend more time on the diagnosis. So try and always ask yourself, what is the resource constraint? What is the limiting factor on this property? Is it labor? Is it water? Is it nutrients? And is it plants? You know, is it compost? Is it soil nutrition? If you can figure out what the limiting factor is, and you run it through that concept of water access and structures, you might not need a water harvesting element, but at least you've thought about it, as opposed to just going onto a property and blindly placing water harvesting elements everywhere. We really need to try and start from that diagnosis perspective. And I think that's the piece that's missing most often in permaculture, and why permaculture gets a bad rap. Permaculture gets a bad rap not because permaculture sucks, but because there's not enough education being provided to show people how to create a diagnosis about good design. And I don't think that this is something that permaculture suffers from. I think it's all of the design fields suffer from this. I think that we, as a Western civilization, we tend to really gravitate towards technique, so how people do things. And you just have to look on Facebook, for example, of this, or even YouTube. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of videos on how to do specific techniques, but there's very few videos on how to think about problems. And that's the piece that I really like to harp on. And every year I've tried to strengthen that a little bit more in the way that I teach, because I think it's the piece that it's actually the resource constraint. And a lot of times the problems that we've created as a species are not because we're stupid. It's not because we're trying to go and create destructive systems that don't work. It's not because we, most of us anyways, wake up in the morning and think about how to screw the earth. The problem is that we don't take enough time to really diagnose the problem. And some of my projects can take 3, 4, 5, 6 months to complete when I get consultancy. And when I have that kind of amount of time, I might not be constantly thinking about the problem, in my prefrontal cortex, but it's banging around in the back there somewhere. And as a result of that, it kind of just miraculously kind of fits together. And usually in that time, I have to have a couple more interviews and have to talk to my client a few times, to see their property a couple of times. But that diagnosis process is something you cannot rush. And so if you have any questions about diagnosis, I'd love to talk about that tonight. If you have any questions about water harvesting, earthworks, I'd love to talk about that tonight. If you have any questions about Brad Lancaster's book, we can talk about that as well. Before we complete tonight, if you found this valuable, I'd love it if you guys hit the like button. If you're not subscribed already, please hit the subscribe button too if you're finding this useful. Lots more videos coming your way. Next week, we're going to talk about how to take these concepts, because I know a lot of you are gardeners, and we're going to apply it to the garden. And this is always a challenging thing, is like, how do we take this knowledge of water harvesting and then apply it into something that I already do, or something that I'd like to do? So we're going to break that down into water harvesting and gardening using a permaculture methodology. So where to get more information? Again, this video will be up again at, later on tonight. So check the show notes for resources. I'll try and capture some of the stuff that I talked about tonight. Our mailing list, I try and write a weekly-ish email. I've been a little bit slow on the emails recently for various reasons, but we will be picking that back up again. We have free e-courses, which again will be in the show notes. Passive solar greenhouse case studies. I'm launching a brand new passive solar greenhouse course in a couple of weeks. So these case studies are going to be taken down and not available for free for much longer. So if you want to watch them, I recommend going over there and checking those out. That'll be in the show notes. Live training, we teach a permaculture design course. Some of you have taken it on this call. I'd love to see you guys at one if this is resonating with you. It's 2 weeks of jam-packed information like this with a bunch of different people, community building, and teaching you guys how to create resilience and potentially even your own permaculture-based business, if that's something that you're interested in. You can find more information on our website at vergepermaculture.ca. We've also got online training, the Permaculture Pro webinar series, where it's a little bit more intimate conversations. If you've got projects that you're working on that you need answered by an engineer or somebody that's been in the permaculture space for a while, that's a really inexpensive way to get access to me on a weekly basis for 8 weeks. There's also going to be other people on that phone call as well that you can ask questions of, people like Curtis Stone, Dakota Cohen, Chris Magwood, and lots of other people as well. Every time it's going to change a little bit. And then there's some consulting. If you want to have any of this mapping done, or you want to have a diagnosis done on your own property, by all means, you can check us out. We have a consulting page on the Verge Permaculture website. How you can support this course, hit the like button below if you found this interesting. Share it on social media. Every time you share this video, it helps my channel track. I'm working really hard to build this channel up and to create a space for permaculture on YouTube that's unlike any other one. So it really helps and gives me motivation to keep going. Leave your comments. I love comments on all my videos, so by all means comment on it. And if you got some value from this presentation, maybe consider donating. So I'm here now for another, I've got 45 minutes actually, so I can answer any questions you've got. If the questions stop, then we can, we can call it early. But if you guys keep asking questions, I'll stay here for another 45 minutes. My family's out skiing right now, and so you've got me all to yourself. So I'm gonna scroll back up into the comments there, and I'm going to answer some questions for you guys. So I'm just gonna go up here. I'll get to the new questions last. I'm just gonna see what questions we have. Yeah, the videos of Brad's place are amazing. I highly recommend checking out Brad's YouTube videos. Frankie says, prevention is key. If you want natural contour of the land and determine the flow of water, we'll be able to establish and prevent future problems. Field B, Goofy Roofy, I agree. Okay, so question 1. Can you collect contour info in the winter season, or can it be done year round? So seek to find yes and no. So if your property is captured by your local municipality, I think you're from Alberta, so depending on where you live, you should be able to get that data from your municipality or online. If the data doesn't exist, then we generally will do all of our mapping in the spring, summer, and fall. Depends on what the conditions are like. And is that information available from your rural municipality? So some rural municipalities will give you that information for free. If you have oil and gas on your property, chances are they've done a contour map for you. And so if they want to be your friend, they'll sometimes give you the LiDAR data, or the point cloud as it's called, for free as well. Del Hansen, love it. Genevieve, haha, great shirt. Gabby, love it. Yeah, Javin got one of our t-shirts recently. I love my Manitoba maple. I'd tap that t-shirt. Too funny, B-man. Mark, I have had such a positive influence on you. My wife is so proud. All right. I'm getting Jen that shirt for her birthday. I'll get it in large. Okay. All right, just looking at questions here, guys. Yeah, Javin makes a good point. Make sure EPDM doesn't have fire retardant in it. Killer of soil biology, absolutely. Okay, just going through the questions here, guys. Okay, deer resistant orchard. There's hope after all. Yeah, there is. You know, it's about working with plants that deer don't eat, I guess, or on your inner zones, potentially blocking them out. It gets really expensive to block out huge parcels of property, and questionable whether or not you should. But definitely, when we get into our inner zones where we grow our food, it's not a bad idea to block them out. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Totally. Field B, I really love this apple alley. Please remind us of the location again. Invermere. Yep, absolutely, Invermere. Christine Wist, Field B, it's in the East Kootenay between Golden and Cranbrook. Yep, totally. Yvonne Watson, cabin fever, anyone? Absolutely, guys. I should make that announcement. So this weekend in Calgary, for I think it's $20, so almost nothing, you can come to Cabin Fever, which is being hosted by the Calgary Permaculture Community Group. And it's full of workshops basically for free at $20. And then we're going to have a party afterwards. There's going to be some beverages, and I'm going to be there. I'd love to meet you guys if you've been on my YouTube channel. It's going to be a great opportunity to socialize with other people that are in this space doing this work. So absolutely make it out there. You can find that at the Calgary Permaculture Guild website. You can Google that. All right, Frankie, due to your class, I think this will be one of my best gardens ever. Awesome. I'd love to see photos of it. Groundswell, I believe, is the name of the group that runs the greenhouse. Seek to find. Rob, do you have any examples of mistakes for your homestead plans? I've made so many mistakes. I don't have any plans, but you can ask me, about anything. One of the I've made mistakes with how I build my swales. I've made mistakes with how I insulated my house. I've made mistakes with the types of solar tubes that I put on my house, the light tubes that we have. I have a YouTube video about that. I've made lots of mistakes. And I think you wrote me on YouTube and said, how do you prevent, and maybe it wasn't you, I apologize if it wasn't, but how do you prevent yourself from making mistakes? You don't. Mistakes are some of the most important learnings that you can get. I'd say they're more important than the successes, because we tend to, mistakes are painful, and we learn through pain and pleasure. And I don't know, I think that some of the most profound learning experiences that I've had have come through mistakes that I've made. The trick with making mistakes, though, is to try and take small, slow solutions, like David Holmgren says in his book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, so that when you do make a mistake, it's not going to destroy you, essentially. I watched this couple online, and they are homesteaders, and they have, sorry, there we go. Sorry, I lost the comment there. I watched this couple online, and they are homesteaders, and they have 3 acres of property. However, their work is a failure in design due to harvesting water. They have to carry. Meanwhile, they said, not sure. I think your comment might have got truncated there. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I don't want to criticize anybody, because we never get taught this stuff. I mean, it's once you start thinking this way, it becomes second nature. But if nobody's ever introduced you to these ideas, then you know, you do make a lot of mistakes, and sometimes they cost you a lot of money. And so I don't know. I mean, I obviously I'm biased, but permaculture has changed the way that I look at everything. So that's why I'm so passionate about it and teaching it online. It's not the solution to everything, though, but it definitely gives you a framework to think about problems. Genevieve, Rob, my question, what is your opinion on pond liners, when and when not to use them? So, I mean, it's going to depend on your application, I think. If you can build a pond and you've got enough clay on your property to build it without a pond liner, don't use a pond liner. They're expensive as anything. There's also different types of pond liners out there as well. So you can get bentonite impregnated pond liners that basically are 2 layers of geotextile with a bentonite core in the middle, and as they get wet, they'll expand and they seal. Those are incredible. They're made out of natural materials, mostly so. And so if you do have a pond leak problem, then I would recommend looking at those. They're self-healing as well, which is really neat. So if you do puncture them, because they're built of bentonite, they'll self-heal. So those are really neat. You know, in a wicking bed, I absolutely would use a pond liner, just from you know, longevity perspective. And as Javin said, make sure there's no fire retardant on them. Seek to find, Rob, do you have a list of questions you ask to explore design plans? Or in other words, is there a form to fill out to prepare for an intake interview? You know, Seek to Find, that's a really great question. I used to do an intake form, but I found that my clients didn't really know how to answer the questions. Either they were too technical, or it was, you know, beyond where they were currently thinking. And so when I get together with a client or a couple of clients, I just have a regular conversation with them, and I ask them very open-ended questions like, what's motivating you to do this? And what are you struggling with? And what are your dreams, goals, and aspirations? And what are you trying to get at that you can't get to? And if you could, you know, change anything, what would it be? And what do you think your weak links are? And what are you really struggling with right now? What's making you super mad? Like, really kind of humane questions that kind of get straight to our humanity. And part of that, and I like to have conversations where I can actually see their face, because when I'm looking at somebody's face as I'm asking these hard questions, there's the information that they give you when they talk to you, but then there's the information that's embodied in their face as well, and their facial expressions or body expressions. And you can learn almost as much, maybe more, from those body expressions as you can you know, from their response. And so this is the kind of art part of diagnosis, is knowing how to interpret what your clients are actually saying, and then comparing that, or doing a Venn diagram with the technical components. And then as a result of those two things coming together, if there is an intersection, helping guide them towards that intersection point based on the information that they've provided to you. And the property that they have as an example, or their dreams, goals, and aspirations. The holistic goal process is really valuable as well, and that creates a lot of information for us to go on. And once I have a holistic goal in place, I've helped the client build one, then we use that holistic goal as a way of making recommendations. So once somebody says that these are the types of quality of life statements that are really important to us, and then you go and look at their technical situation, and you've had all these other interviews with them, from there, you can start to see idiosyncrasies, but you can also see contradictions. As humans, we're full of contradictions. And sometimes it's a matter of showcasing those contradictions and bringing them to the surface so that people, you know, when you see a contradiction, you can say, well, is this quality of life statement true? Or is this statement that you made over here true? Which one is true? Because based on those two different things, I'm going to have different recommendations with regards to what you should do. So a lot of consulting is actually not telling people what to do, but trying to figure out what is driving them, and then looking at the resources that they've got and the goals, dreams, and aspirations, and trying to find that middle ground, that intersection point. That's where the sweet spot is. Frankie, permaculture did nothing for them, but they were struggling to bring water to themselves. And all the time I was thinking, water acts as shelter. No, just a point, work is a failure in design. Totally. I mean, again, we use water access and structures to understand what the broad strokes of the property are. So where we should put buildings and where we shouldn't put buildings, where we should put ponds and where we shouldn't put ponds, where we should put swales, where we should put you know, if we should put swales, where we should put rain gardens, where we should put food forests, gardens, all of that stuff. The broad strokes get laid out with water access structures, because if we go back to that map that I showed you earlier and you know where the water's traversing, it'd be really stupid to put a house in that water course, right? I hope that's obvious. It's not obvious to civil engineers, and it's not obvious to city planners, because what happens is with these massive new subdivisions that go in, they do that mapping, and then they use that map to basically terraform the property to channel the water in different directions, except that nature is stubborn. She's been working that way for millions, billions of years, and all of a sudden we decide that we don't want her to function that way anymore, and we change the course of her water, and she says, well, I want to keep water going in that direction, and so you're going to have to put a sump pump in to compensate for your lack of humility and your hubris, and you're never going to win against me, because I'm going to be here in a billion years and you're not going to be here in more than 50 or 100. So we might as well take her insights and be humble enough to look at them and say, well, where the water flows is not a place to put a house. It's also not really a great place to put a road unless I make a few tweaks to it. But there might be opportunities to do other things here. If we just look at, like, what does nature put into water courses? Well, she puts beavers and she puts trees and she puts all sorts of vegetation. So there's all sorts of things we can do there. It's not dead space. It's not like we can't use that space. It's just that we have to take advice from her first, and instead of trying to force function her to do something specific. Goofy Roofy. Jake Mace has some good videos of fruit trees growing in Arizona, pushes the subtropical boundaries of fruit such as you see in Florida, with shading and some other things. Awesome. Yeah, share those videos if you've got them. I'd love to see them. Frankie, I believe him and his girl will be traveling the world soon. Goofy Roofy. Awesome. Holly, me too. Jace Mace is great. I've never heard of this guy, but I'd love to see him. Okay, Mark, I'm hoping I'll have good news about that property soon. What mapping technology, computer programs would you suggest purchasing? You know, Mark, I don't think you need to purchase much for that property. If it's the same one that I think you're talking about, it's a fairly straightforward property. You could probably map that out pretty quickly with a transit. However, if you did know somebody with a drone, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, you could probably get it flown pretty quickly if you did want to have a contour map for planning. Drones in Canada are coming under increasing regulation, and so before anybody goes out and buys a drone, you should do a little bit of research to determine if you can even use one in your area and what some of the rules and regulations are about using those drones. In BC, it's a little bit challenging. They've made it a little bit harder to get what's called an SFOC, which is essentially a license to fly. So just be cautious and do your due diligence before you go out and buy a drone. But basically my process is I have a little iPad mini. I use a program called Maps Made Easy. I fly it with my drone if I've got permission. It collects all the photos. I stitch all the photos together. I turn it into a map, and then I run it through some GIS software, which puts out all sorts of slope and contour and water mapping profiles as well. So I have a kind of a workflow that I work through from start to finish. If I don't have the ability to fly a drone, I found a couple of GPSs recently that will do a pretty good job, get you close enough that you can actually fly it. But before you do any of that stuff, I would talk to your local municipality and see if they've got a point cloud of your general vicinity first and some aerial photography, which they probably do. See if you can get it from them. And then from there, we can skip all those front steps and just go straight to GIS and do all of the mapping components. Okay. Sorry, guys, just lost my place here. Just trying to catch up with all the questions here. Okay, Gabby, too bad we won't be able to make it to Cabin Fever. We're only coming out to Calgary during the spring break. Yeah, it's too bad. It would have been great to catch up with you. Goofy Roofy, Rob, what's your take on keyline plowing? So keyline plowing can be a really great tool. And, you know, I know people that love it and I know people that hate it. And so I would say that keyline is just another tool in the toolbox. And so you need to study it and study where it makes sense and study where it doesn't make sense. And my recommendation is that you interview people that have used it successfully and that you interview people that have used it unsuccessfully. And then based on their interviews and your research, you can decide whether or not keyline plowing is right for your particular situation. That's all I really need to say about that. But, you know, I've seen incredible you know, turnarounds with keyline plows. So I think it's just a matter of understanding the context it was designed in and what PA Yeoman's intended for it. And again, like going to talk to people where it works and where it doesn't work. If we get away from the plow though, the pattern of keyline plowing, which is basically creating equi-spaced rows, can be really successfully used if you want to use machines in a landscape, because one of the problems that swales have is that they follow contours, which doesn't always necessarily work with specific machines. However, the thing that you need to think about with all of this stuff is like, what is your end goal? If your end goal is to run a farm with lots and lots of machines, then you're going to want to use water harvesting patterns that facilitate the use of machines. If your end goal is to create passive systems that are more human scale, then you might choose water harvesting features that are more human scale. And that's not to say that keyline patterns aren't human scale. They absolutely can be. Swales can be human scale as well. So I think the best advice that I can give to you on any water harvesting feature is start small and simple, or slow and simple. Try them on a very small scale and see how you like them. So if you want to try keyline and you have access to a plow, do an acre, see how it works, plant a bunch of trees, even half of an acre. If you want to try swales, do half of an acre with some swales. It might seem like you're taking more time to figure these things out, but in the long run, because of what you learn, you'll end up saving yourself tons and tons of time. So try them both, see what happens, and see which one resonates most with you and what your landscape responds to best. So Javin says you have to learn from mistakes. They don't just have to be yours. Integrate design work with others to ensure that you have multiple eyes on over your shoulder to help your challenge your diagnosis. So Goofy Roofy, develop awesome skills is another good channel in the Phoenix area. Awesome. Holly Svek, cool. Goofy Roofy, can you use ducks to glay ponds as well? Yeah, any kind of manure. So the way Goofy Roofy is talking about glaying. And so it's important to understand the base principles of glaying. And then if you understand the base principles, then you can, you know, apply it across various domains. And so what happens when you glaze something, the concept of glaying is when you basically apply manure and organic matter to a surface. What you're actually doing is not glaying it. You're actually creating an anaerobic biomat. And a biomat is essentially just layers upon layers of thick biofilm or microbiological organisms that exude glue. Now, to break this down a little bit more, there are two broad classes of microbes. You've got aerobic microbes, they love oxygen, and you've got anaerobic microbes, and they don't love oxygen. Now, if you're an anaerobic microbe and you don't love oxygen and you live on a planet that's full of oxygen, then you need to develop a mechanism in order to keep the oxygen out. So what happens with anaerobic microbes is they cluster together into communities, and the way that they keep oxygen out of their cells, essentially, is by exuding glues and binders, essentially. And so anaerobic bacteria produce slimes and biofilms that coat them, and these coatings basically lock the oxygen out so that they can stay in an anaerobic environment. So if you put enough duck poop or enough pig poop or enough cow poop or any kind of poop for that matter, and you layer it with organic matter in layers and layers and layers and layers, what's going to happen is you're going to create a really thick biomat at the bottom. And over time, that biomat will produce more ooze and goo and slime and biofilm, and it will start to lock up the particles of the soil. And the best place to observe this happening is actually in a septic field. So if you have a conventional septic field, this is the reason that septic fields don't last for thousands of years. A septic field typically will die after 30 years, because what's happening in a septic field is you're constantly putting out nutrients with anaerobic bacteria in it, and you're putting it into a series of underground infiltration beds. And as those infiltration beds build up a biomat, which is literally in the septic design guide, they talk about the importance of a biomat, because the biomat's also what's eating up all the nitrates and phosphates and all the good and bad stuff that's in septic effluent. As you build this biomat up, eventually the biomat gets so thick that it clogs the pores of the septic field off, and then the septic effluent can no longer infiltrate into the ground. So this is why when we move to aerobic septic systems, so septic systems that have aerobic bacteria instead of anaerobic bacteria, we don't get these biofilms forming, and we don't end up glaying our fields and prematurely killing them only after 30 years. I mean, we're talking about $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for a field. We want this thing to last as long as possible, plus a lot of energy to put it in. And you know, my perfect situation is no septic field at all, gray water and composting toilets, but the code doesn't always allow for that. So glaying of a pond operates on the same way. We're basically creating an open air sewage field that creates anaerobic biomat, which seals off the pores of soil, which holds the water in. That's the premise. So any manure and organic matter that's layered on top of the soil will give you a glaying effect. Hopefully that answered your question. Valley View Farm, Valley Hayfield, the central strip that is a discharge area. Water accumulates in heavy clay gumbo with salinity. I wonder if ponds and swales. Yeah, totally. If you're already getting water there, instead of trying to drain it, I think Valley View Farm, you might be from Ontario. The thing with Ontario that I've noticed, which is insane, is that all the fields there all have drainage tile underneath it. So they're all trying to move the water away. And one of my teachers and mentors, Jeff Lawton, said that when you have lots of water, you just have to learn to live with more productivity. So your system is just 28 times more productive than a terrestrial one. Most of us try and take the 28 times and bring it down to 1 times by trying to get rid of the water because we see it as a liability. But if you are in Ontario, you guys have some of the most progressive aquaculture rules in all of Canada. You can grow the most amazing species in your ponds out there, and a pond will outproduce the same area of wheat, corn, soy, whatever, even hay you can imagine. And there's even all sorts of unique other crops that you can grow there that you've probably never even thought about. So cattails, for example, is incredible pig fodder and cattle fodder for that matter. And because wetland plants accumulate minerals better than in different ways than terrestrial plants do, they can be hypernutrient. I mean, our ponds are typically our nutrient sinks. That's where all the water flows, and they take those nutrients with it. So why not try and bring those nutrients back up onto the land in the same way that the salmon bring nutrients from the ocean back onto the landscape? Valley View Farm might help concentrate the water, help reduce soil water in the adjacent areas, and create new habitat. Absolutely. Field B, my Wednesday evening conflict is that there's a free webinar and conversation with Mark Shepard on the EAT webinar platform of Professor Wayne Dorband in Bethold, Colorado. Wishing that you'd start a half an hour later. Well, I'd love to, but I have 2 little kids, and I have a Harry Potter date with them in about 20 minutes, which is not possible to change unless I want to lose a whole bunch of daddy points. Plus, I really like Harry Potter myself. So, you know, we record all this stuff, and you can watch it tomorrow. And as long as you're getting to the Q&A session, then you're getting one of the more valuable parts of the program. But thanks for your feedback. I appreciate it. What's the web address for that LUV mark stuff? I'm not sure what that means. Jay Clark, with snowfall and freezing temperatures, do you have a problem with your wicking beds and pathways freezing and backing up, or do they just go into the soil without a problem? I've never had a problem with garden swales, even broadacre swales, with freeze thaw, generally speaking. You can get some issues with really big swales if you have massive melts right in the freeze thaw period in the springtime. So you do have to be a little bit careful about that, but not in my garden. I've never had an issue. Jay Clark, I live in Idaho and the ground freezes several feet into the ground. Will that cause problems with the drainage? Not really. I mean, the thing is that it depends. I need to see your property to know, but generally I've had no issues with my swales or any of my water harvesting features. Whenever we get water pooling over top of a water harvesting feature, what we've noticed is that the ground actually thaws quicker. So it actually kickstarts the system a little bit faster. The other interesting thing is that when you have the right water harvesting feature and you have the right microbiology, and farmers have proven this, there's some stunning photos on the internet where you can see one field that has a no-till cover crop approach on this side, and then a till conventional chem ag on this side. And they're both in the same place. There's no trees around them. And this one still has, with the chem ag, still has a ton of soil on it in the spring. And this one is ready to go. And the difference is that this one's got microbes that are exuding heat from the soil and melting the water and infiltrating it early. And this one's still frozen solid. So when you get the microbes working in your soil, all sorts of really interesting upward spirals start to happen. Frankie, the major improvements in my design work over the last 4 years is bringing the designer into my work and saying, tell me why this won't work and what would be better. Seek to find, yes, exactly. I'm trying to start my goals and contradictions I can already see in my ideas. Frankie, thanks for sharing, Javan. Goofy Roof, if city planners used it, they would save so much energy and trouble. Absolutely, and they are starting to use it. You know, we have some really progressive city planners in Calgary and Edmonton, and it's amazing that this stuff is starting to be implemented. It's great. Javan, Mark, are you in the CVRD? If so, LiDAR in the area is accurate down to 1 meter, which is plenty good enough for you, Mark. Frankie, Jake Mace is doing what you and Michelle has already done, traveling the world and connecting with farmers to see who they can stay with overseas. Interesting, the two of them. Northern Homestead, we just took out a wicking bed in the greenhouse because it was leaking. Just a heads up that if someone builds it, make sure not to use something like, basically don't use builder's poly. That's what I was trying to say earlier. Mark, thanks, Javan. I may follow up with you for clarification. Field B, Goofy Roofy, the link gets scrubbed here using the chat line. So I'd like to get bit.ly / I'm going to hope that you interpret it correctly, etc. Goofy Roofy, thanks. I signed up for a webinar series. Field B, Glay is good. Frankie Robertson, I can't say no to the kids, totally. Kona, HP for the win. Javan, Mark Dahl, drop me a line next week. And Javan, Rob, you're a stellar designer and presenter. Thank you for your time, mate. What a gem of a human honeybee. Perfect. Glad you guys enjoyed it. We're at the end of the questions right now. If you haven't hit the like button, please do that. It's a great help for my channel. We're going to be on YouTube. I think it's 3 o'clock on Friday, talking about living larders. So this is how to create root cellars that are in the ground and living. If you want to sign in for that, that'd be great to have you. I'd love any questions that you've got about it. It's something we're exploring with our clients right now, where we can build them living root cellars, essentially. So instead of storing it in the ground, just keep it in the ground. We will be back next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with new content. Next week on Wednesday, we've got part 6 of the introduction to permaculture. And you'll see this up a little bit later tonight. And again, if you have any questions that you want me to answer on YouTube, please send me an email. And I'd love to hear from you guys with regards to how this content is changing the way that you look at the world and the value that you're getting out of this stuff. And we will see you guys all again on Friday, or next Wednesday, or next Monday, or Friday after that. So thank you so much, guys. Have a wonderful evening. I'm going to go read some Harry Potter to my kids.